Hi, I'm back. I know it's been 2 months. Yeah, I've just been lazy. I'm not gonna lie to you guys. So in today's video, we're gonna be doing a steering. What was it? It's been a while. We're gonna be doing a steering rack on an older TL. I want to say it's a 2006, 2007, right around that range. And let's just hop in the video.
And before I forget, if you could be so kind to leave a like, and please consider subscribing. Oh, did I finally say that right? Nice. But seriously, I see that 99% of you guys that watch my videos aren't subscribed, so please consider it. And here we go. The first thing you're gonna do is disconnect the steering column from the steering rack. And to do that, you're gonna remove this 10mm bolt back there. Yep, right here. And yeah, we can move on to the next step. Okay, so the next thing you're going to remove is the strut brace. So it's a couple of 12 or 14mm bolts that's on top. If you have aftermarket ones, it might be a different size, so don't quote me on that. And you're going to have a couple of 10mm bolts holding the fuse box and a couple of brackets attached to it. With the strut brace out of the way, you're going to have access to a couple of brackets and bolts that hold the power steering lines in place, and access to the bolts that mount the steering rack to the subframe. Subframe. Come on, brain. And you're going to have to disconnect the lines coming from the rack itself. Right now I'm trying to show you all the mounting bolts and all the mounting points and everything that's attached to the steering rack, because essentially you have to disconnect everything from the rack before it can be pulled out of the car. And don't worry, you don't have to remove the subframe from the car. You only have to lower it a bit. Don't mind this part, it's just going to be a time lapse of me removing all those bolts, and let's just fast forward. Now, to make sure you guys are smarter than me, make sure you drain the system of fluid before you start taking the lines off. I took them off and made a mess. Right now I'm using a crow's foot to crack the lines open. It's going to be, I believe, a 19 and a 14. If the lines are severely rusted, they might just break when you try and get them loose. At that point you got to replace the line too. If you don't have a crow's foot, you can always use a flare wrench. I'll put a picture of both of these tools right here. And that's the best way to get these lines out, because if you use a regular wrench, you have the chance of rounding that nut over, making your life a complete hell. Ask me how I know. The reason why I like the crow's foot is right here, where I can just take the ratchet off and just use my hand to get the last few parts of it out. And that's just because of the room. It's just easy. Sometimes it's just easier to get my hand in there and force it open. And here we go, another time lapse of me showing you the work and then going ahead and doing it. So just skip over this part. And here is your second line on the rack. And you see that giant pool of power steering fluid just sitting everywhere? That's why that's why you're supposed to drain the system of fluid before. I don't know what I was thinking, just trying to get through it probably. And yes, I cleaned up my mess afterward, don't worry. Lots of brake clean, lots of water, lots of soap. It just added more time to everything, where I could have just drained it out in the beginning. I should have mentioned this before, but to gain access to the bolt that's closest to the firewall on the driver's side, you have to remove that steering line out of the way. When you get that line out of the way, you'll have an easier time getting to it from up top. And a quick flat rate tip right here, if you just remove this 10mm bolt from up top, you can bend that shield out of the way to gain access to the mounting bolts on the passenger side of the steering rack. Five minutes into the video and we're just now lifting the car off the ground. Just remove both front wheels and we'll hop on to the next thing. And here's a side note, you can try and remove the 14mm bolts on the passenger side through that wheel area if they come out, but the easiest method that I have found was to grab them from up top with a long extension on a socket with a swivel attachment on it. For me, that seems to be the fastest and easiest, but if it's easier for you to get access to the bolts from right here, a short socket and a long 3/8 ratchet, and go for it. Loosen up the jam nut for the inner tie rod end, and before you put the socket on there, you're supposed to remove the brain fart. 5 minutes later, cotter pin. Thank you. Remove the cotter pin, take out the nut, and before you take it out completely, leave a little bit on there so that when you're hammering out the outer tie rod, you're not in danger of damaging the threads. And yes, I know I completely ignored my own advice right there. Now this clip was supposed to be clearer on how to remove your outer tie rod from your steering knuckle, but I completely whiff it and nail the brake, help me here, the shield, I'm trying to remember, what's the proper name, dust shield, brake rotor dust shield, that thing. I completely whiff it and just, you'll see. Boom! You see that? That's why I'm a bad tech. Nah, all jokes aside, you just got to be aware of it and be careful of it. You can always bend it back. The main purpose of that thing is just to keep dust coming from underneath the car getting into your braking system. So it's not, I don't want to say it's not a big deal, but it's not the end of the world. And right here, we're just going to remove a couple of the shields underneath it because we need to gain access to the subframe bolts. All we're going to do is lower the car 2 inches, not lower the car, but lower the back side of the subframe 2 inches so that we have enough room to finagle the steering rack out of its place and then twist it and pull it out through the driver's side. And now the fun part. We're going to be loosening up the bolts in the front end of the subframe, and all you want to do is loosen them because the goal is to remove the middle and rear subframe bolts so that the cradle or subframe hangs down at an angle and you have 2 points of contact for the front subframe, because the last thing you want is to drop your engine out of your car and be stuck. So here's the middle subframe bolts that I'm talking about. You're going to remove the, I believe it's 17 that connects it to the body of the car. And you're supposed to remove that bracket out on the driver's side because that's where the steering rack is going to come out of. And don't worry, I get to it later, but I was already there and it would have been faster if I just took it out there. Ideally, you want to remove the A-pipe or the front pipe in this car, but because the bolts were so corroded and I was too lazy to grab the torch and torch them off, I just decided to lower it off the bracket there and try and gain access to the rear motor mount bolts that connect the rear motor mount to the subframe. Right here there is a rear motor mount bracket that the motor mount sits on top of. That bracket ended up getting stuck because of one of the bolts that I didn't take out. So what I did was grab a pry bar and pry in between the bracket and the subframe, and that was able to give enough tension to drop the subframe the rest of the way to take out the rack. Right now, I'm double checking to see that the steering racks are going to match up and to make sure they're exactly the same. This involves making sure that the mounting points are matching up, the entries for the power steering lines are going to match up, and to make sure that, especially right there, that rubber bushing matches up in the right place. And then I'm going to finish swapping everything over, which includes the outer tie rod ends, input shaft cover on the steering rack itself. There are a couple of different methods of swapping over the outer tie rod end. What would be easiest for you would be the count number of turns it takes for the outer tie rod to come out of the old steering rack. What I did right there was measure it off an old extension and just mark it with a Sharpie. The only benefit to that is the fact that I don't have to think and I don't have to remember the amount of turns, mostly because I'm lazy and I have bad memory. But there really is no difference, just whatever's easiest for you. And when I'm putting it all back together, I put some anti-seize, just a hint of anti-seize on the end of it, just to make sure that it doesn't seize in the future. That's all. After swapping everything over, all you have to do is just do everything you did, but in reverse, to put it all back together. And tech tip, if you're doing this on the floor, just use your jack to help push the back of the subframe back up, and then you don't have to work as hard putting the rear bolts back in. Other than that, it's not so bad. Right now, I'm just going to leave you with a nice time lapse of everything in reverse. Again, if you could please consider subscribing, or leave a like, or leave a comment if you want me to change this video style up. But that's all I have for this week. Thanks in advance. Alright, one last thing before I forget, or I did forget and now I remembered. Make sure you top off the system with fluid. Typically we use genuine Honda Acura fluid. I don't have any experience with anything else. All I know is that I've had no problems with the OEM stuff, so your discretion at that point. But make sure you put the fluid in, you bleed it. 2 bottles should be enough if you're using the OEM stuff. And remember to reconnect the steering column again, and you get the car aligned. It's very important because your alignment will be out of whack from messing around with the subframe and the steering rack itself. Again, if you like this sort of stuff, feel free to subscribe. If you didn't, drop a comment down below because I genuinely, why does that sound so weird? I genuinely actually care about making better videos, better. Nice grammar. But seriously, just let me know. I want to improve. That's all. Thank you.